welcome back to Yoga Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Waycott. By the time you're listening to this episode, we will have reached a really exciting milestone. We will have actually surpassed our first 500 downloads of the podcast. So I want to share a genuine thank you to everyone who's tuned into the podcast so far. I'm well aware that 500 downloads is a pretty small milestone in the grand scheme of podcasting, but I am intentionally celebrating, some of these early markers and early milestones. And part of that is just because my personal tendency is to go from one thing to the next really quickly. So I am trying to make a conscious effort to pause and enjoy these little moments, when they're here. And just take time to kind of celebrate my wins more frequently. So I think maybe I need a cake or something that says 500 downloads. But part of my intention behind the podcast is to share insights and education with yoga teachers in a way that transcends geography and kind of goes beyond local yoga scenes that can sometimes feel a little bit insular. And one of the wonderful things about living in the age of information is the way that knowledge can be disseminated around the world really, really quickly. And so Yoga Insider has already reached yoga teachers in 17 countries, which to me is just wild. And I can't wait to look back a year from now and see how much growth has taken place. So in today's episode, I am talking about imposter syndrome. And I'm taking a look at why it shows up so often for yoga teachers. And I'm also going to offer some reframes throughout the episode about the fact that imposter syndrome isn't always a bad thing. And sometimes, it can actually be a sign of growth and expansion, especially if you're able to move through it instead of getting stuck in it. So let's get right into the episode. If I were to synthesize all of the different definitions of imposter syndrome, the characteristics that seem to show up across the board are feelings of fraudulence or self-doubt. So it's often a belief that we hold that we are not as competent or knowledgeable as others perceive us to be, especially in the context of our work. But imposter syndrome can really show up in any part of our life. But today we are looking at it, in the context of being a modern yoga teacher. So, for everyone, I'm sure imposter syndrome shows up a little bit differently, but it can present itself as persistent patterns of self-doubt. It can show up as negative self-talk, things like downplaying your accomplishments, maybe delaying opportunities or saying no to opportunities when they come up because you've, decided that you're not ready yet, or maybe you think you're not worthy of the opportunity. And sometimes it can also be believing that your success is just because of luck or because of, the right timing rather than from your abilities or from your efforts. And for yoga teachers, imposter syndrome can sometimes be very amplified because what we do is public. So there is a significant element of visibility that comes with the territory of the work that we do. And when we teach, a lot of the real learning actually takes place on the job and in the classroom. So one of the things that's really unique to being a yoga teacher is the fact that we have to learn our craft in public in front of an audience. We will also inevitably make mistakes and lose our place and fumble over our words. And we will make those mistakes in public, in front of an audience, which can be absolutely terrifying for a lot of people. And then there's really no hiding if you choose to teach yoga. Like, you can't hide when you're actually up there in a room teaching behind, a keyboard or a filter or Photoshop or Facetune or whatever people are using. It's literally just you, and you are leading the room, and you're doing the best that you can with the knowledge that you have available to you at that specific time. So when you make mistakes or you fumble, people are going to be watching. And that's one of the really, really unique elements that comes along with being a yoga teacher that is different from other lines of work. And so a lot of people are inspired to teach yoga because yoga has impacted their life so profoundly. And I think every yoga teacher has a story. I have stories about the ways that yoga has impacted my life. And some of those stories I'm not even ready to share yet because they're just so personal and I'm still processing them. And so for a lot of us, what I'm getting at is that our work isn't just work. We're actually sharing a piece of ourselves to an audience of folks who are often strangers. And that's something that takes a lot of courage and a lot of vulnerability. And I think anytime we share from our hearts and essentially put ourselves out there, we put our art out there, like teaching yoga is inherently creative. Imposter syndrome has a way of kind of creeping in, right? It can be really sneaky. And I'm curious if sometimes maybe that imposter syndrome is a little bit of a protective mechanism too for some of us as yoga teachers. It's I'm going to start doubting myself and questioning my abilities right away as a form of defense against the potential criticism that comes with putting myself out there and, being visible and sharing something visibly with the world that I really care about and that really matters to me. And I feel like I'm almost hyper aware of imposter syndrome just because these days, the nature of my work puts me in rooms with a lot of yoga teachers. Everything from running trainings to workshops to peer discussion groups, even my weekly classes. A good portion of the students who attend my regular pre-registered classes are actually yoga teachers themselves. So I'm with yoga teachers every single week in some capacity, most of the time, multiple times a week. And then even for myself, if I'm traveling to attend trainings, I'm surrounded by yoga teachers all the time. And it is a conversation that shows up again and again and again, regardless of the year or the place or the country that I'm in, the conversation that shows up over and over is the imposter syndrome conversation among yoga teachers. And sometimes it almost feels like it's this rite of passage that every yoga teacher needs to experience imposter syndrome. But it doesn't need to be that way. And, when I reflect on my own journey, I realize that I've absolutely had my own cycles or kind of more intense periods of imposter syndrome and kind of working through it. And I think what's interesting is that I actually did not experience imposter syndrome when I first started teaching. When I was a brand new teacher, I didn't have it. And that kind of stands out because I think it's often quite loud for new teachers. And we have these conversations about imposter syndrome all the time in 200-hour trainings. And like when I'm working with teachers in training, it's just like, it's such a big thing that a lot of people feel. And I didn't have it in those early years. I don't exactly know why, but like I was just spending time, teaching in community centers, in gyms, in studios, universities, clinics, like all these very kind of practical environments. And my goal was like to learn to teach. I was in my own lane learning my craft. And maybe because I was a really, really young person when I started teaching yoga, maybe I needed like that extra time to just kind of like keep things simple for myself before I branched out into anything, beyond that. But imposter syndrome did show up for me eventually. And since then, it showed up lots and lots of times. But it wasn't until I was about 6 years into teaching yoga. And when it arrived, it was right when I started doing something a little bit different. And in that case, it was when I started to run event type yoga classes. And this wasn't like the studios I was teaching at were like running events and just asking me to lead them. This was a totally independent endeavor. And I was the one reaching out to local businesses, collaborating with them to bring larger event style classes to their spaces. And one of the features of these classes was that most of them featured live music. So I was organizing these classes, I was advertising them, I was the one selling tickets, and I was just, kind of stepping out on my own and like exploring something new. And like when I look back, they weren't necessarily a big deal, these events. Like the actual teaching wasn't, it wasn't like complicated. And it certainly wasn't, the things that I do now, which are more like education focused. This was just kind of like, experiential, like group yoga. But it was funny because it was like the moment that I stepped into something new, suddenly I was getting a new type of attention and a new level of visibility because I was like putting myself in front of a different audience and different people who'd maybe never practiced with me before. I was stepping outside of the typical spaces where I normally taught yoga classes. And, part of that attention that I was getting meant that not all of it was positive attention. Not all of it was supportive, which is, just part of life. But some of it kind of sounded like, ooh, like, why is she doing this? Or that's not what she normally does. Like, it was kind of like, who does she think she is? Like, why is she, stepping out of her lane in this little tiny box that we know Alex to fit in? And like, why is she doing something else? And so even though I knew that my intentions were positive, there was a little bit of noticeable external scrutiny that made me start to doubt myself. And that was really interesting. And I found myself questioning whether I was actually allowed to expand and evolve. Because prior to running events, I did stay in this very comfortable lane and I just kind of stuck to what I knew and the places that I knew. And as soon as I stepped out of it, there was like this new level of visibility that came with it. And it was in that process where I really started to experience imposter syndrome. And what I've found is that pretty much every time I step into something new or I step into some kind of unknown territory around teaching, a bit of that self-doubt and internal narrative that's really like, do you know enough to be teaching this? Like it rears its head. And, as I gained more experience, I started putting together more education-based workshops. Like it wasn't just experiential events. It was like, there was planning and there was a lot more thought that went into what I was putting out there. And so I was creating CE programs and smaller trainings and mentorship groups and 200-hour trainings, even like this podcast that I'm doing right now. And every time I stepped into a new level and stepped into something new, like I have had to grapple with that internal dialogue. And so when we're thinking about imposter syndrome, what I've found is that a lot of times it's not even activated by failure. It's actually kind of triggered by visibility, right? Of like being seen and putting ourselves out there and being in front of people. And I do find, like, just talking to so many yoga teachers over the years and being one myself, that imposter syndrome can show up really, really intensely for yoga teachers. And there's definitely several layers here. One is just the fact that yoga can look vastly different depending on the lineage, the setting, the trainings that you've taken, the population that you're working with. And there isn't a clear set of directions that say, okay, this is exactly what a yoga teacher needs to know, and this is exactly how a yoga teacher needs to teach, right? Like, we don't have anything like that. There's a lot of gray area when it comes to teaching yoga. And so the way that we approach teaching might be informed by a whole variety of influences. And we all have our own mentors, our own experiences as students that inform the way that we teach. A lot of us have taken completely different certifications. We have our own personal philosophies that come into play. We are influenced by the communities that we grew up in, the communities that we live in, the populations that we work with. And then over time, we all develop our own style and our own priorities. And I think because of this, it's actually really easy to fall into the trap of comparison, especially in an industry where everybody's teaching looks really, really different and we all sound different. And like, our evolution as yoga teachers unfolds at different speeds. So when you don't have any instructions or like map to measure yourself against, it's so easy to assume that everyone else has it figured out and you don't. And then that's when we get into that like comparison spiral that can lead towards feelings of imposter syndrome, where we're questioning our style. And a lot of times people are questioning if like maybe they should teach more like someone else. Like, maybe I should teach more like that teacher that has 1 million followers on Instagram, or that teacher that's really popular or gets, more opportunities than I do. And that's tough, but it's also like a really real thing that a lot of us experience. Somebody recently described my teaching style as eclectic, and I'm in a place where I take that as like a huge compliment, but I feel like maybe in the past when I was younger, I would have been like, ooh, yuck, like eclectic. But I was thinking about it, and like when I teach, I draw from a pretty wide range of sources and disciplines, and it's because I've been studying and practicing and teaching for a pretty long time. And that means that I've been exposed to a lot of different approaches to yoga. So rather than being dogmatic and saying like, there's only one way to do things, I think that my classes have been like kind of turning into a synthesis of the things that I think are effective and useful and interesting. And they're also always evolving because I'm always learning and I'm always experimenting. And what I want to get at is like, if you have your own style and if you're doing things a little bit differently, it's not a bad thing. And I feel like it's a huge like sign of authenticity. Usually it means you are drawing from lots of different influences and you've kind of found your own voice within that. And I always think that you're better off to lean into your uniqueness rather than trying to copy someone else because you think that person like has the blueprint or they've figured it out, because like they probably haven't. And like you're just better off to be yourself anyways. And there's also this other element that really plays into it. I mean, there's so many different things that can cause imposter syndrome for yoga teachers, but I do think that the rise of yoga influencers, especially in the last 10 years, and like online yoga influencers is what I'm getting at, is something that can feed imposter syndrome in a way that's really real, because these online yoga influencers are presenting yoga in a way that is very curated, very aesthetically pleasing, and they're kind of giving us a version of the practice that doesn't always even have anything to do with yoga. And then like the real teachers who are, out here like in the trenches actually teaching people, we are sometimes comparing ourselves to those influencers online. And we're like, well, I don't have that same fancy, $1,000 matching outfit that she has. And maybe the space that I teach in isn't the most aesthetically pleasing. And, I think maybe it's not going to look good in pictures. And maybe I can't perform the shapes that person on Instagram is making, even when what they're doing is maybe like, I don't know, contortionism or calisthenics, like maybe not even yoga. And something that I want to emphasize is that just because someone is very visible and has, 100,000 followers online and gets brand deals, it doesn't always equate to them being skillful or being experienced. So we have to remind ourselves that a lot of what we see online and a lot of what is presented online as yoga is an illusion. It's a distorted version of reality. And if what you are consuming online doesn't feel inspirational or aspirational or educational, and if it's causing you to compare yourself and feel self-doubt and fall into that cycle of imposter syndrome, then I would kind of, I don't know, maybe do an audit of like who you're following and consider like what you're consuming, right? And then the other thing that I, again, really think comes into play here is that for women who teach yoga especially, we have been conditioned to keep ourselves small, to be quiet, to downplay our accomplishments because we don't want to seem like we're bragging, because that's off-putting. And nobody likes someone who's full of themselves, right? Like you can't win. But obviously, imposter syndrome, it doesn't discriminate based on gender. It can affect anyone. But I do hear from a lot of women who teach yoga that this is something that really affects them as yoga teachers. And sometimes there is a societal conditioning that we have to unlearn in order to step into the next version of ourselves, or like a more expansive version of ourselves that doesn't play small anymore. And this is something that's really real for me right now, especially as I learn to podcast. I am brand new to this, and it's probably obvious if you're listening to the podcast. I've only been podcasting for a few months. I don't have a teacher teaching me how to do this. Like I'm figuring it out as I go. And, in the process of sharing about my podcast on social media, I have lost tons and tons of followers. And I've mentioned this on a previous episode. It's like every time I log in online, my follower count goes down and down and down, especially when I post about my podcast. And sometimes I do reflect on the fact that like I would probably be more likable and more digestible if I just stuck to posting cute pictures of my butt in yoga pants with like an inspirational quote next to it, right? And it's like, as soon as you start sharing some thought leadership or contributing to the broader discourse in yoga land, people are like, oh my God, what's she doing? Like, what does she think she's doing? I don't like this. And it's kind of like, I don't know, if you're a younger woman, it's like, you can either look cute or you can be smart, but you can't be both. And people will like freak out if you're both. So I'm facing real life imposter syndrome right now. But I know that like choosing to have a podcast is part of my personal and professional expansion. And I know that going through this like growth phase that I'm going through right now, where I'm literally learning something new in public, that can be a bit awkward, right? Like growth is awkward, but I'm here for it, right? And we have to see these like uncomfortable times as part of the bigger vision, right? And like, I also trust that, losing followers online is part of the process, and like, things are going to build back up and grow eventually. And if there's one thing that I know for sure, it is that imposter syndrome rarely shows up when you are operating within your comfort zone. It usually shows up when you're doing something new. It shows up when you are building new skills, when you're doing something where you're becoming more visible to more people. It shows up when you are stepping into leadership, when you are raising your prices or asking for a raise. It shows up when you are teaching in new environments. It shows up when you are creating your first workshop or running your first training. And it shows up when you are putting yourself into maybe spaces where you haven't been before, right? Like having a podcast and like putting my voice into the podcasting space, right? Like that's a space where it can show up. And it is usually a sign that you are on the precipice of growth. You're standing at the threshold and you are about to step into something new, and you don't know what's on the other side. I feel like that's when imposter syndrome gets the loudest. And I think that looking at imposter syndrome as a sign that you are growing and kind of like stretching yourself or like shedding your old skin, whatever you want to call it, like that's actually super, super exciting. So the reframe that I want to offer you today, if you are a yoga teacher that is experiencing a little bit of imposter syndrome right now, or maybe a lot of imposter syndrome, is to try to focus on the growth. So instead of asking yourself, who am I to do this thing that I want to do? And you get into that kind of repetitive thinking where you're feeling like you're not smart enough and you're not experienced enough and you're not popular enough and you don't deserve the opportunity and you're making excuses. Like, rather than thinking that way and letting yourself get caught in that cycle, can you ask yourself the question, what lives on the other side of that thing that I'm scared of, or that thing like where I'm feeling doubt, or I'm not sure if I should do it, or I've been talking myself out of it? Like, what is on the other side of that fear? Because if we keep doing the same things that we have always done in exactly the same way that we've always done them, like, that's fine if you're comfortable there, but you're never going to expand. So when you orient yourself towards what is possible, instead of getting caught up in all the things that could go wrong and all the reasons why you shouldn't do the things that you want to do, then things actually get really exciting because you've given yourself permission to move forwards. And even if you're moving forwards and you feel fear or you feel uncertainty, you're still taking a step towards moving closer to that next version of yourself. And sometimes that means that you're also changing and outgrowing your previous ways of doing things. And not everybody is going to understand that. Not everybody is going to come along for the ride with you. And, that's just how it is. But yoga is an evolving practice. It's a living practice. And as teachers, we are active participants in that evolution. And part of that means that we also get to evolve, like as teachers on a personal level. So know that there is often more clarity on the other side of that fear and that doubt that you might be experiencing. So imposter syndrome is a sign that you're expanding, that you are stepping into something new, you are becoming more visible. Maybe you're kind of transitioning from teacher to a teaching role where like you have more leadership. It might even be that you're just experimenting and trying like new ways of doing something, or you're implementing new techniques. Like I would really try to see it as like a sign of growth, and like it's not a bad thing as long as you're not getting stuck in it. But something that I would get curious about, if you do find that you are getting stuck in imposter syndrome and it's hard to kind of take that next step out of it, is I would get curious about whether or not you are self-sabotaging a little bit, because I think sometimes imposter syndrome can also bring out behaviors where like we start to procrastinate, for example. And I've seen this happen so many times with so many really like skillful yoga teachers who have a lot to offer. Like maybe you have a great idea for a workshop that you really want to share with your community, but like you keep putting it off and you keep making excuses and saying, well, I'll run my workshop in the new year. And then, the new year comes and you say, well, I'll run my workshop after the summer break. And like it just kind of keeps dragging on and you just push it back like month after month. And you never actually do the thing that you say you're going to do. Like you never book the venue. You don't post content online about this thing you want to run. You don't send a newsletter about it. And like, even though you want to do it, maybe you're scared of what happens when you actually do, just because there's this sense of unknown and like you don't know what's on the other side of this thing that you haven't done before. And the other thing that I also see is like self-sabotage sometimes shows up as like over preparing or falling into that trap of over certification, where again, like I've seen this so many times where people say, I'm just going to sign up for one more course and then I'll be ready to teach, or then I'll be ready to, do this thing I want to do. I'm just going to do one more training. I'm just going to do this mastermind. I'm just going to do this mentorship program. And that pattern like drags on and on as well for a long time. And people are just out here collecting certificates, right? Because they think like, well, they don't know enough to teach, but the real learning happens on the job, right? So if you want to learn to teach, you actually have to just get out there and teach and like mess up in front of people. And it's really awkward. And like we all go through the process. But a lot of times, falling into that trap and getting more and more certifications. And like, this isn't to say don't get certifications, because I'm a huge advocate for continuing education and, taking workshops and trainings and reading and learning and studying. Like, we need to have that kind of student mindset forever as yoga teachers. And you can do that all you want as long as it's not getting in the way. But sometimes if you just keep taking certifications and you don't actually teach, then getting stuck in that cycle is just kind of delaying your growth, right? Because you're not actually like taking action towards going out and teaching. And And lastly, I'll just say, and like this is something that's so real for me, is sometimes we can hyperfixate on the opinions of other people and like external voices, especially our peers. And so I would just really be honest with yourself and do a little bit of self-inquiry and just check in. Like, am I making excuses or avoiding being visible because I'm afraid of what people think or because one person said something about me? Are you holding yourself back from your potential because you're worried about what other people think? Right? So really just thinking about like the ways that imposter syndrome can also lead towards behaviors where we are, self-sabotaging and kind of getting in our own way. And I do think that every yoga teacher experiences imposter syndrome at some point. And it is usually because you're growing and you're expanding. And instead of kind of interpreting that discomfort that comes with imposter syndrome as something bad, I think we can really learn to start to see it as proof of expansion and proof of growth. Like, it doesn't have to be a negative thing. And like I said previously in the episode, growth is generally awkward, but that is also how you know that you're not remaining stagnant or staying stuck in the same loops. So the reframe that I want to offer today is that growth is something positive, and the only constant in life is change anyways, right? Like, we are always changing. We're always evolving. Nothing ever stays the same. So when you're at a point where you feel like you're moving into the next version of yourself, you don't need to shrink yourself instead just because you want to make other people comfortable. You don't need to wait for permission either to like step into that version of yourself or start trusting the trajectory that you're on. You can try to find the potential for growth and learning within your experience of imposter syndrome so that you can move through it to the other side and not feel stuck. Because the work that you do as a yoga teacher is so important and it's so needed, and like, you need to be out there in the world impacting people and sharing what needs to be shared. So if this episode landed, share it with another yoga teacher who might benefit from the reminder. I want to say thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Yoga Insider. I will see you next time.